Um, okay, so first things first, I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I'd like to thank all the organizers for putting this together, especially Joanne Abel here at the Durham County Library and Elizabeth Dunn and Tyler Gilmore at the Rubenstein Library at Duke, who have played a very interesting role in the research that has led to this presentation. So just to give you a general lay of the land, we're going to talk about the relationship between Doris Duke and her yoga teacher, Yogi Rao. But to kind of make sense of this story, to put it in context, we're going to briefly go over what yoga in America was like in the late 19th and early 20th century. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, very good. And then at the end, we'll have time for some questions and answers and maybe some discussion. So, at a recent Academy Award ceremony in Hollywood, Ang Lee accepted his Oscar for Best Director and ended his short speech with, "Namaste, India." While the recognition was appreciated in India, Lee's salutation barely registered in America. Namaste is now part of the American vocabulary, as yoga studios can be found on every street corner, and black yoga pants are a clothing staple for women everywhere. A yoga teacher, meditation instructor, or personal guru has become another standard member of a Hollywood entourage, and entertainment magazines overlap each other with lists of yoga-devoted celebrities. 60 years ago, yoga in America was far less popular than it is today, and was seen in a much different light. Yoga and those who taught it were mysterious and held an air of mystical, otherworldly power. It was during this time that a bearded yogi from India named Lakshmanasandra Shrikanta Rao came to Hollywood and created a national sensation when he took on the heiress Doris Duke as his pupil. So to make sense of their relationship before we get into it, it'll be very helpful to give an overview of what yoga was like in the early 20th century. So today, yoga is very kind of standardized and homogeneous. I think one of the most telling features of yoga today is how tiny the differences between styles are. One school of yoga is differentiated from another because they correct postures, or they play a different kind of music, or the room is hot as opposed to being cool. Also, what's very interesting about yoga today is that there is this kind of confederacy of strange bedfellows that all make the assumption that the yoga that is practiced today is ancient, it is Indian, and that it is somehow spiritual or religious. One of the big pieces of scholarship on yoga that's come out in the last few years was by a professor named Mark Singleton, who did a fantastic book called Yoga Body. And what he found through extensive research, interviews done in India, is that the yoga that is practiced today is modern, it is uniquely postural and centered around the body, and it's transnational. What he found is that while postures, asana, have a long history, a style of yoga that is centered on the body, seeing the body as its ultimate result, is very modern. Modern yoga basically comes together in the early 20th century in India, and it's taking in a lot of non-Indian elements such as Swedish gymnastics, Western bodybuilding. It's arising in a context that's concerned with evolution, colonialism, Indian nationalism. One of the aspects of yoga's popularity today, and anyone who's reached a certain age where they start becoming interested in genealogy knows this, yoga in America has come of age because it's starting to care about its past and its antecedents. So most histories of yoga in America begin with this man, Swami Vivekananda, in 1893, who addressed the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. This is kind of a very simple and easy and genteel opening chapter for yoga in America. But what I suggest is that a more appropriate beginning for yoga in America comes 3 years earlier in 1890 by a man named Wilkie, who was a cub reporter for the Chicago Tribune at the time and eventually became director of the Secret Service, he published an article on the Indian rope trick. He claimed to have been on the streets of India and saw a wonder worker throw a rope up in the air which stayed suspended. A child was sent up the rope. Everyone disappeared. He took photographs of this, but conveniently nothing came out in the photographs. So the solution that was posed by Wilkie and by everyone, ranging from common people to scientists, was that this was an act of hypnotism. There was no rope trick, but the fakir or the yogi still had the power to hypnotize a crowd into believing that they saw this trick being performed. And this was the dominant understanding of what yoga was and what yogis did. They were holders of magical mental powers. And then this idea was kind of broadcast throughout the United States through small armies of stage magicians and fortune tellers and popular accounts in newspapers and periodicals. You may ask yourself, well, how could such ideas take hold in America? One of the reasons I think is that you have very few actual people from South Asia in America at this time. There's very little contact between India and the US. At the height of South Asian immigration in the early 20th century, there are at most 3,000 people from India in the country. So there's very little presence to dissuade these wild ideas of what goes on in India and who yogis are. This is a personal favorite of mine. This is from the late 1890s, a breathless headline on the front page of a Wisconsin newspaper, "Real Hindu in Eau Claire." And as you go through the article, it becomes quickly apparent that it's no real Hindu at all. So histories of yoga in America, the few that have been done, they have this kind of large empty space between Swami Vivekananda, who we saw, and the 1960s. It's hard to avoid the boom in yoga starting in the mid-60s on. So there are brief mentions of perhaps Paramahansa Yogananda, the author of Autobiography of a Yogi, in the late 20s onward, maybe the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. But when you really get down to the historical record, when you start pouring through newspapers and magazines and ephemera and pamphlets, there was a very vibrant yoga world in America during this time. There were dozens of teachers, and in a way they functioned almost like yogic circuit riders. These teachers would travel from town to town. Usually they would have a large free lecture that was open to the public, and this would feed into smaller private courses, and those would sometimes feed into personal didactic relationships, either as consultants or personal student-teacher relationships. Also during this time, there was a great anxiety about Asian religions and immigration from Asia, and these kind of combined. Proponents who wanted to restrict or completely stop immigration from South Asia used religion as a justification. These people are clearly unassimilable. Their religion is incomprehensible. They have what was referred to at the time as a Hindu mind that was incapable of industry and hard work, that was given to abstraction. And likewise, fears about Asian religions in America played on this idea of what was called the tide of turbans flooding into America. So what a lot of critics of Eastern religions, Hinduism in particular, used is they took these dramatic examples of yoga students and yoga teachers, and they combined them all together to make this kind of working thesis of what happens when people do yoga. Well, clearly, they leave their spouses, they become crazy, they starve themselves to death. It's a very dangerous, serious threat. And tying back to the Indian rope trick, the idea that a yogi was a hypnotic wonder worker, that they had mental powers of persuasion, this kind of fed into ideas that were already existing about hypnotism and fears of someone with hypnotic powers. They were sensual, they could overpower someone's will, they could take their money, and so when you ask what did yoga look like in the early 20th century, besides small pockets of students and devotees of particular teachers, the popular conception of what yoga was and what a yogi was essentially this, a dangerous, conniving Svengali. So into this framework, we have Yogi Rao. He first makes his appearance in the historical record in about 1932, and his age is very slippery, but from the best that we can surmise, this is when he would have been in his mid-1940s. We see him appearing in different large cities in India, Calcutta, Bombay, New Delhi. Apparently, he also died in Rangoon, Burma. His repertoire was dramatic feats of stage magic that he would present as miraculous yogic acts. These included swallowing the heads of live snakes, drinking nitric acid, and eating a various assortment of glass, tacks, needles, and plates. Again, my condolences to all of you who actually did bring a bag lunch. He would do these in kind of official, respectable venues. He would do these at sports clubs, at hospitals. The reports that we get back are very clear about how respectable and scientific the audiences are. And interesting aside, one of the places he does his routine is at a Theosophical lodge in Bombay. Here is a picture of him later on eating glass. I love the fact that the magazine took the liberty of blacking out one of his teeth to make him look that much more exotic and bizarre and terrifying. What was interesting about these performances is they got widespread media attention, but they were taken very seriously by not only scientists who, not being able to see the stage magic being used, wondered endlessly of how he could swallow acid and live, how he could eat glass. This was also taken up by proponents of yoga who wanted to put this out to the world as evidence of the miraculous and superhuman powers that were possible through yoga. And going back to Mark Singleton's thesis on modern yoga, what's very interesting, and this is logical, if modern forms of yoga, postural yoga, is being developed in India around the 1920s, we shouldn't expect to find postural yoga in the United States at the same time. It's going to take time to develop, to transplant itself. So when we look in America before the 1950s, what is described as yoga, what is practiced as yoga, what is thought of as yoga, what's taught as yoga, has very little of posture in it. There are very few asanas. Yoga is seen as a matter of mental concentration. It's seen as a lifestyle, a change in diet. It's often referred to interchangeably with yogi philosophy and yogi breathing. These are the dominant elements of yoga during this time. So Yogi Rao is doing his demonstrations in the 1930s, and then he seems to disappear from the record, but he comes back in a vengeance in March of 1951. He was an expert at manipulating the media. He was someone who could come up with a very good hook, tell it to the right person, usually a reporter for the Associated Press, and then get endless mileage out of it. So in New Delhi in March of 1951, as he was gearing up to do a world tour, he gained worldwide exposure by claiming that his yogic powers had granted him immunity from the atomic bomb. And in 1951, this would garnish some attention. Unfortunately for the general populace, he said this would take 12 years of serious yogic practice. So too late for most people. But this gained worldwide publicity for him, which kind of seemed to grease the wheels of his world tour. He leaves India in December of 1951, and he goes to London. Always a good person to make a first impression. He walks outside wearing very little. He also had a habit of getting attention by going to restaurants and consuming glass and plates as his main course. He arrives in New York in early 1952 and does the same thing, devouring a water glass to prove the triumph of spirit over matter. And it's not difficult at all to see how South Asians and how yoga was viewed in America at the time when you just look at the simple juxtaposition. Yogi Rao eating glass and Ling Wong of Chicago's Lincoln Park Zoo trying to eat a telephone. So how does Yogi Rao get from New York to Los Angeles, where he meets Doris Duke? As with many trends among the rich and famous in Hollywood, Yogi Rao's acclaim spread through word of mouth within tightly knit social circles. And the man who gave Yogi Rao his entree into this world was Herb Jeffries. In the early 1930s, when he was in his early 20s, Jeffries began to sing and perform with various jazz ensembles. I kid you not, inspired by a Western shot with an all-midget cast entitled The Terror in Tiny Town. Jeffries convinced its director, Jed Buell, to shoot an all-black Western. Harlem on the Prairie was then created, followed by other films such as Two Gun Man from Harlem and Harlem Rides the Range, which were shown in segregated black theaters throughout the South. Another Western, The Bronze Buckaroo, would give Jeffries his enduring nickname. The Bronze Buckaroo was not necessarily what his moniker suggested. As revealed when he married burlesque dancer Tempest Storm in 1959 and declared his race to be white, conveniently avoiding a violation of anti-miscegenation laws, and further shown in a series of articles and documentaries over the last several years, Jeffries was actually born as Umberto Alexander Valentino to an Irish mother and father he never knew, who was a mixture of Sicilian, French, Italian, and other ancestries. In an unusual example of reverse passing, Jeffries used the flexible category of, quote, Creole from Louisiana to play with all-black jazz ensembles, and as an actor, literally had bronzer applied on set to play the part of the Bronze Buckaroo. Jeffries would explain this at different times by saying that his mixed ethnicity made any racial categorization absurd, and portraying himself as an activist for equality who created a silver screen icon for, quote, kids who looked like me. And it's easy to dismiss Herb Jeffries, but his role as the Bronze Buckaroo in the films that inspired actually had a large significance to Black America. If any of you have heard of the musician and the producer Herbie Hancock, his full legal name is Herbert Jeffries Hancock because his parents named him after the Bronze Buckaroo. Jeffries developed a strong interest in Eastern religions starting in 1943, a few years after the end of his cinematic career. Although the exact order of their initial meetings is unclear, Herb Jeffries knew both Yogi Rao and Paramahansa Yogananda, founder of the Self-Realization Fellowship and author of the perennial classic Autobiography of a Yogi. In 1948, Jeffries was in a small plane crash and severely injured his back with 3 fractured vertebrae. Doctors recommended a risky surgical procedure that had only a moderate chance of success. His aunt thought he might find help elsewhere and gave him a book she had read, Autobiography of a Yogi. Jeffries traveled by train from Detroit to Los Angeles, met with Yogananda, and learned yogic and meditative techniques that he claimed miraculously healed his back and made him a devotee of Yogananda to this day. Herb Jeffries is over, I think he had his 100th birthday last year, so he's Bronze Buckaroo, still riding on the range. And just a very interesting aside, as I was preparing for this talk, I came across an article from a medical journal in 2009. So the perennial chestnut for any of these kind of unusual spiritual experiences is always, was it real? Was it fake? Was it a trick? Was it just a placebo? And so this recent medical study in 2009 suggests that the answer to all of these questions concerning Herb Jeffries and Yogananda and the healing of his back, was it real, was it fake, was it placebo, might be yes to all of them. So they did a randomized trial between placebo and an actual surgical procedure known as vertebroplasty. And what they did is they randomized patients, and on the operating table they performed essentially a faux surgery where they opened up the back, closed it without doing anything. They would even open up the bone cement that was used in the procedure. And what they found was that the success rates for the fake surgery and the actual surgery were virtually identical. They had the same rates of success. The logic behind the study was that if pain reduction happens for long enough a period of time, that in this specific type of back injury, the body is essentially given a window of opportunity to heal itself. And so however this pain relief comes about, it will still be effective. So regardless of what Yogananda did to Herb Jeffries in his back, it worked, even if it only worked through Jeffries believing that it worked. So after Herb Jeffries' cinematic career, he was over in Europe and stayed after World War II. And so while living in Paris in July of 1951, Jeffries saw Yogi Rao on his world tour coming towards London and America. He saw Yogi Rao walking down the street, and keep in mind this is a time of limited immigration, and he marveled at his good fortune at coming upon a genuine yogi just there on the street. So he made numerous inquiries and finally located Yogi Rao after several weeks. 1 year later, in July of 1952, the Bronze Buckaroo and Yogi Rao were once again together, this time in Los Angeles. And it was here in Los Angeles that Jeffries introduced Yogi Rao to the blonde bombshell Marilyn Maxwell, a stunning actress and entertainer known through her roles on radio and film. Marilyn Maxwell told Doris Duke about her yoga teacher, and it was at the home of Marilyn Maxwell that the two of them, Doris Duke and Yogi Rao, finally met after Doris Duke was made to wait, by different accounts, either for 3 consecutive days for him to show up or for one 7-hour stretch waiting for his arrival. So once news that Yogi Rao was guiding Doris Duke in the study of yoga surfaced, it created a sensation. The Los Angeles Mirror chronicled their relationship over an entire week in a 5-part series of articles filled with photographs, advertised across the country, and titled The Yogi and the Heiress. The life of Yogi Rao, as described by him, bordered on the ridiculous. He claimed to have been an orphan at an early age. He admitted to a past as an actor, a circus performer, and advertising pamphleteer for local cinemas. But he claimed that these were all roles that he was told to take on by his alleged guru, Swami Sitaramji, in order to fulfill his spiritual mission and basically make yoga palatable and noticeable to a general public. And Yogi Rao has some amazing moments of honesty where he claims that he started studying with his alleged guru in India because he wanted money, and he heard that yogis had the ability to manifest gold coins. In his travels throughout India, Rao claimed several animal companions, including not only a vegetarian tiger and tap-dancing bear, but also a dog that could chant in Sanskrit and a calf that could count to 10. What was ridiculous in Yogi Rao seemed to be counterbalanced by the powerful hold and influence he seemed to have on his students, some of the most famous and rich people in the world. So if Yogi Rao seems to have been a Rasputin-like character sent direct from central casting, in a sense he actually was. Rao claimed to have been hosted at the Russian embassy while he was living in Delhi and offered the role of Rasputin in a Soviet-controlled pseudo-propaganda film due to the similarities in their appearances. And he claimed that the Russian government even shot some screen tests in Bombay. And surprisingly for Yogi Rao and the stories that he told about himself. There actually seems to be photographic proof of this. The dangerous and sensual Svengali air of Yogi Rao was only strengthened by the presence of his French secretary, Janine Schneider, who was shown in the LA Mirror series serving the yogi a meal while looking up at him adoringly. The reporter for the LA Mirror, Omar Garrison, was also happy to supply innuendo to the connection between Doris Duke and Yogi Rao, provocatively phrasing their time together as, quote, secret meetings and, quote, moonlight strolls, although their contact seemed limited to simply daily lessons at Doris Duke's rented suite in the Beverly Hills Hotel. So this brings up the question of what was happening in this hotel. What was the yoga that Doris Duke practiced? Again, all of you with your lunches, bless you. True to the period, the yoga that Yogi Rao taught to Doris Duke had very little in the way of physical postures or asana, especially not the standing full body postures that we assume, or the vinyasa or the flow of one posture to the next. It was primarily just a few seated positions. Rao also gave very little in the way of absolutes or strict guidelines. While never demanding strict abstinence from his student, Yogi Rao rather encouraged a gentle sense of moderation in his student. Drink less alcohol, eat less meat, and go out less frequently at night. Doris Duke's diet included healthier fare like rice. She did simple seated postures and meditation exercises and breathing exercises for 30 minutes a day. And she started to practice hygienic kriyas, such as clearing out her sinuses with a waxed cord. After a few weeks of yogic lessons with Rao at her suite in the Beverly Hills Hilton, Doris Duke, who was a few months shy of her 40th birthday, was convinced of Yogi Rao's positive influence. Her proof was a photograph of her taken in a nightclub that had shown the heiress to be looking younger and more radiant. But the transformation was more a matter of simple changes in lifestyle than anything miraculous. 23 years prior to Doris Duke's meeting of Yogi Rao, a writer for the LA Times named James Warnick bemoaned the city's growing reputation as the cult capital of America. Quote, that which is most sadly needed by a majority of these mystics is wholesome exercise, plenty of sunshine, a reasonable amount of good food, 8 hours of sleep every night, companionship with their fellows, and probably a family to love and work for. Warnick seemed to partly foresee not only Yogi Rao's success with Doris Duke, but the basic model of hospital programs trying to influence lifestyle change and rehabilitation centers today. It is likely that these two forces, common sense moderation and mystic claims to superhuman abilities, worked in concert with Yogi Rao, as they did with many of his peers. Until proof for a student could be found in practice, it could be seen in the miraculous. Yogi Rao did not deal solely in private lessons with the rich and famous. He made some effort to do the same things that public exponents of yoga did during the time. He claimed to be writing a book of philosophy and also editing a collection of his lectures. For a very brief instant in August of 1952, he did exactly what you'd expect a yoga teacher during this time in America to do. He gives a series of lectures at a rented hall. I believe that this is probably, in name only, the group that Yogi Rao tried to form, the Society of International Brotherhood of Men. And here's another ad for one of his handful of lectures. Yogi Rao also made modest attempts to position himself not just as a wonder worker, but as a Hindu missionary and religious figure, calling his bungalow apartment an ashram, calling his students by the traditional title of chelas, and asserting that his yoga would ultimately lead to liberation and union with God. Rao even redubbed Doris Duke as Gita, after the 700-verse Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and snarky newspaper columnists said that Gita was Gita a lot of money, according to Yogi Rao. Perhaps returning the favor of Marilyn Maxwell to another in need, Doris Duke introduced her yogi to Barbara Hutton, the heiress to the Woolworth fortune and one of the few people on earth whose wealth came close to Duke's massive fortune. Hutton was going through her 4th divorce and recently suffered an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. And if you wanted to maybe create a type of rich celebrity who is following Yogi Rao, when Duke becomes his student, she had gone through 2 divorces and a tragic miscarriage. Duke brought Yogi Rao to Hutton in hopes that he could help straighten her out. According to Hutton's biographer, she signed up for a series of 50 single-hour sessions with Rao. For the cost of roughly $1,000 an hour, and this is in 1952, the Woolworth heiress, who is also notorious for a very foolish sense of generosity, sat on a rug and chanted mantras with Yogi Rao by candlelight. And as an aside, Yogi Rao would not be the last person Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton would share in common. 1 year after studying with Yogi Rao, Hutton would be married for less than 2 months to international playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, Doris Duke's ex-husband. Doris Duke also wrote out a series of 4 checks to Yogi Rao that combined for a total of $4,000, an amount that seemed massive to the public, but in reality comprised only a fraction of Doris Duke's expenses. And here is Yogi Rao with a banker who, in a very clearly staged photograph, is expressing disbelief that the richest girl in the world would sign over checks to this man. And courtesy of Special Collections at Duke, here are the stubs to the actual checks that were written out to Yogi Rao. Rao claimed to have had an ashram, a school, and an orphanage back in India with dozens of mouths to feed, and some of Duke's contributions were ostensibly to help purchase a tractor and other basic equipment for this noble charitable work. Yogi Rao was also given use of Doris Duke's Ford. So Yogi Rao's rapid rise seems to embody a very twisted version of a Horatio Alger success story, in which a single person arriving in America with little more than their ability to eat glass and drink nitric acid, through luck and pluck, miraculously arrives at success beyond their wildest dreams. With a grand total of only 10 months in the United States, Yogi Rao had massive publicity and a stable of students that included celebrities, and in Duke and Hutton, literally 2 of the richest women on the entire planet. When he seemed perfectly poised to achieve even greater fame and fortune, Yogi Rao left suddenly. He made a quick stop in London with his standard glass-eating routine for a group of reporters, and after a brief attempt to establish a British school of yoga with a pending donation of £75,000 from a benefactor that never materialized, Yogi Rao was back in India. There is no tangible evidence to explain why Yogi Rao left the United States so soon, but there are several likely reasons. The articles published in the Los Angeles Mirror were undoubtedly done with the active and enthusiastic cooperation of Yogi Rao. With the exception of a snapshot of Duke leaving a nightclub that was obtained from an outside agency, every single photograph included Rao and was taken by a staff photographer from the Mirror. Likewise, every direct quote used was from Rao. While the coverage was good for him and consistent with the publicity he regularly sought, it was certainly a massive breach of confidence for the extremely private Doris Duke. The articles syndicated in newspapers across the country could have easily done irreparable harm to their relationship and burned bridges for the yogi among her peers that also valued discretion. In plain terms, Yogi Rao could have also simply got out while the getting was good. He may have balked at the large amount of money that he was given and was hesitant to take it all. One account given decades later recalled that Yogi Rao drew only a fraction of the amount given to him in Doris Duke's series of checks. He may have also realized that he was in way over his head. While Yogi Rao could have relied on his stage magic to create the appearance of yogic wisdom for a short while, with small audiences of reporters and a handful of individual students, it would not have been enough to function in the anticipated role of a public yoga teacher. Creating an organization, publishing books, and handling the array of problems that would have come to him as an established teacher, such as Herb Jeffries and his injured back, would have required a different skill set and a much larger base of knowledge. And this is a very interesting subtext to the dozens of yoga teachers that are coming over in the early 20th century. When you poke into their biographies, they are extremely well educated. They're going to private Christian schools in India, They have graduate degrees in logic and philosophy, either in India or from UC Berkeley. So these are not people chosen by the divine at random to come to the United States. These are very intelligent, well-versed, capable people who can handle the task of publishing books and giving lectures and handling large organizations. If Yogi Rao is viewed simply as an immigrant, then his rapid departure makes sense in another way. If a common aspiration of most immigrants to the United States is to make money, support their families back home, or to make enough money and then return home themselves, then Yogi Rao could have simply done what he set out to do and went back as planned. There's also abundant evidence, mostly from Rao himself, that despite the assumption of celibacy in an ascetic yogi, that he was married and possibly had children. And in one later account, possibly my favorite quote from him, he said, "I am just a simple man trying to support his 3 wives." Yogi Rao remained relatively quiet for almost a dozen years after he left Southern California. But while based in Delhi in 1965, he began to receive press once again for his standard routines of glass eating and cyanide sipping. Several years removed from his world tour, his memory of his past celebrity students became fuzzy and expanded. Marilyn Maxwell became Marilyn Monroe, and both Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin were now counted as former students of his. It was all a foreshadowing of Yogi Rao's final emergence on the world stage, and one that would prove to be a most embarrassing failure. For years, Rao had hinted to reporters that despite his seemingly miraculous powers, a true yogi would be capable of doing the truly impossible, walking on water. In the summer of 1966, Yogi Rao decided to publicly perform the feat and had a special steel tank built for the event. There were bad omens leading up to the event. 3 days earlier, one of the walls of the steel tank collapsed and had to be repaired. The day before the event, Yogi Rao slipped and injured himself. On the day of the event, a crowd of over 600 people, including movie stars, politicians, and attendees who had all paid steep prices for admission, had gathered to see the Hatha Yogi perform one of the miracles that Jesus himself performed. As a warm-up, Yogi Rao performed some of his standard fare of glass eating, fire walking, and acid drinking, and then he ascended the 5 steps leading to the tank, stood on the edge in silent and focused meditation for 15 minutes, stepped wholeheartedly onto the water to start his 20-foot walk across the surface, and then promptly sank. Dozens of police officers present kept the angry crowd who demanded a refund of their money from assaulting the already humiliated Yogi Rao. By the mid-1960s, yoga was becoming one of India's most well-known international exports. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was touring the world, and a growing list of famous and powerful figures, both West and East, were attributing their creativity, health, and success to yoga and meditation. Many in India had hoped to bolster yoga's reputation through scientific proof and rational explanations of its practical benefits. While Yogi Rao's other feats, done 3 decades earlier, seemed to offer tangible proof of yoga's superhuman powers, his failed water walking was an embarrassment that threatened to sink much of that potential prestige, and the response to his failure was intense. Some in the press demanded an apology from Yogi Rao, who they claimed embarrassed the entire nation. Others were scandalized that the standard entertainment tax was not applied to a mundane performance that clearly failed in proving itself supernatural. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was asked at a news conference if she believed that sadhus could walk on water. She derisively shook her head no. Yogi Rao himself was similarly upset about his failure. He was quoted as saying, another one of my favorite quotes of his, "I am so angry that I feel like drowning myself, even if I have to tie a stone around my neck to do so." Almost 2 years later, Yogi Rao resurfaced and told the Times of India that he was going to reattempt the feat to convince the public that he was not a fraud and once redeemed, retire from public life. He claimed to have been undergoing an arduous spiritual discipline to prepare for the second attempt. God willing, he told a reporter, I shall succeed this time. The second attempt never happened. Yogi Rao's pledge was his final act speaking with the media, and the legacy he left behind was a cautionary tale of failure and embarrassment. 3 years after the original attempt, in a 1969 article on Science and Yoga, the Times of India described it as a, quote, nosedive into oblivion. 5 years after that, in 1974, an article on the search for the medical benefits within yoga in the Los Angeles Times ended on a skeptical and derisive tone, with Yogi Rao, quote, sinking like a stone. So now we have the whatever happened to, where are they now section. Omar Garrison, the reporter who wrote the 5-part series, The Yogi and the Heiress, for the Los Angeles Mirror, simply repackaged that series and had it published by the pulp magazine Fate, which might speak equally to both Fate magazine and the quality of the Los Angeles Mirror. Years after the article, Garrison became a proficient freelance writer and authored a steady stream of books. One of these was a biography of L. Ron Hubbard, commissioned by the Church of Scientology. And this opened up a Pandora's box of legal disputes, bad publicity, and defectors from the church when research spearheaded by Garrison found major discrepancies between Hubbard's claimed past and the actual historical record. In the mid-60s, Garrison moved from the sidelines of yoga to a more authoritative role by penning the book Tantra, the Yoga of Sex. The book claimed to offer its readers, quote, the actual rites, plainly and accurately described by a longtime student. And Garrison himself, in his LA Mirror articles, claimed to have spent years in India. But the lessons within the book and the exercises, such as staring into a mirror to see your past lives, were more likely products of Garrison's imagination than the, quote, Hindu and Tibetan literature that was claimed on the dust jacket. Doris Duke, the most famous student of Yogi Rao, never stopped wanting to believe in miracles or being willing to pay for them. For the next 4 decades until her death in 1993, Duke's life was filled with a dubious assortment of psychics, mystics, healers, astrologers, and aura readers. She gave $1 million home to Dayamata, a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. For a while, she was also devoted to the faux Tibetan healer known as Norbu Chen, introduced to her through the former astronaut Edgar Mitchell. Norbu Chen was a Texas con man who spent time in mental institutions and prison before claiming to cure an assortment of diseases with grape juice fasts and psychic powers. Near the end of her life, Duke adopted a former Hare Krishna devotee named Chandi that she sadly believed was the reincarnation of her lost baby daughter. Yogi Rao claimed that he would attain samadhi, liberation, and voluntarily leave his body around the age of 125 or 150, which would mean, depending on the math, that he's either alive today, enjoying his last year, or will pass away in 2039. It is more likely that he died a normal mortal death many years ago. Yogi Rao stopped appearing in the newspapers he courted so vigorously after his failed attempt to walk on water. But more telling were the revelations made by Yogi Rao's friend and confidant, the Indian writer A.R. Kanangi, in 2006 and 2011. They were the type of confessions that a confidant would not dare to make during the lifetime of their friend. Like other stage magicians and sleight-of-hand artists, Yogi Rao was bothered by the success of the renowned God-man Satya Sai Baba, who had built a religious empire upon amateurish tricks of sleight-of-hand, such as manifesting wristwatches. And I would direct any of you to YouTube to see all of these tricks explained and broken down in excruciating detail. Rao, who like many other stage magicians could perform the same miracles as Sai Baba, boiled over with anger and told Kanangi step by step how anyone could remake themselves into a guru. As Kanangi recounted in several published articles beginning in 2006, Yogi Rao explained to him how to make oneself over as a yogi, step by step. Quote, first you have to create an image. You can't be a sadhu if you wear trousers and a jacket. And then you must spread the word that you went to the Himalayas and kept your head at the feet of the Guru. Nobody will check, of course, whether you have actually been to the Himalayas. That Himalaya tag is very important. And then, armed with extraordinary powers, you descend to the plains and begin performing miracles. I can do better than that, rascal, Satya Sai Baba. I can drink nitric acid, drink water, bring it out of the nose, walk on burning embers. When Kanangi confronted him and asked him if he was cheating people, Yogi Rao responded, quote, "It is not cheating. People want this. They want to believe in miracles. They are confused and afraid. They all want a crutch." It would be unfair to single out Doris Duke. If she wanted a crutch, it was a crutch that was perhaps well-deserved and sought out by many other people, both then and now. While at first glance Yogi Rao would seem to be an unusual figure to hold up as an exemplar, he still speaks to our time. Even as yoga has become commercialized, systematized, scientifically studied, there's still a mystique and air of authenticity in America around a teacher from India or even an American who has studied yoga there. Celebrities are still paraded around by their gurus and yoga teachers as a method of easy publicity and proof of the power of their teachings. Today, as described by yoga scholar David Gordon White in his book Sinister Yogis, palm readers and fortune tellers from India can still be found on Melrose Avenue and Hollywood Boulevard, and many, like Rao, are quick to show photographs of orphanages that desperately need your financial donations. Perhaps more importantly, Yogi Rao offers us a glimpse into a fascinating lost chapter in the history of yoga in the United States, a time that is as recent to us as it is disorientingly different. When yoga was mental and magical, a man who ate glass could be triumphed by scientists and spiritual seekers, and when the richest girl in the world was known, for a brief moment, as Gita. Thank you.